Anyway, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Paul de Schueren, who is a professional engineer, and he's been a beekeeper for 15 years, managing 10 hives at their farmhouse in the town of the Blue Mountains. During this time, he's gained much experience either by trial and error, not always the best way to learn, or by networking with other beekeepers and experts in Canada. More recently, he has used that experience to mentor new beekeepers and promote beekeeping within the community. Paul is the past president of the Toronto District Beekeepers Association. In this role for over 5 years, Paul was engaged with fellow beekeepers, both hobby and commercial, research scientists, university PhD students, government agencies, bee inspectors, and more. Beekeeping is not what it used to be. The challenge today is keeping our bees healthy as they face new pests introduced through the global movement of goods and new pesticides that have a detrimental effect on our honeybees. At the same time, we need bees for pollination and for the honey on your morning toast or in your coffee. Paul is excited to share his experience as a local beekeeper, both the joys and the challenges of beekeeping in Ontario. And I'd also like to give a mention that in waiving his speaker fee, Paul has asked for us to make a donation to the Toronto District Beekeepers Association, so we're pleased to do that. So now I'd like to welcome Paul to the front.
Thank you. It's great to be able to speak about bees, and I don't know how much you know about bees. I know a little bit. As was said, I'm a hobby beekeeper, right? And actually my wife Heather's here as well, and she's just as much involved in our bees as I am. So we'll just move forward here. So there's a picture of me and obviously Heather as well. I guess you figured that out. But what's important here is, and what you're seeing is a swarm. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about swarms and what do swarms mean. You know, a lot of people get nervous about swarms and think that there's something bad going on, but they're actually absolutely amazing. And if you ever get to see a swarm, it's something in a lifetime that I hope everybody gets to see. So go to the next slide, please. As was mentioned, I was past president of the Toronto District Beekeepers Association, and like you, we have monthly meetings where beekeepers get together. We try to share different, learn from each other, share different things. It's really critical for us because there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the government. There's a lot going on in terms of learning about bees and just understanding what happens, right? So we were luckily we were introduced to the Toronto District Beekeepers. We lived in Richmond Hill. We bought our farm up here 15 years ago. We've had bees for 15 years, and luckily we're here now, retired and living here full time. So it's awesome. I do want to mention the OBA as well. So we have this kind of umbrella group, the Ontario Beekeepers Association, and they're a fantastic organization. They help in terms of education and pulling all the beekeepers across Ontario together. So that's awesome. And you'll also hear me talk about OMAFRA. Okay, OMAFRA is the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. And anybody that's a farmer or knows anything about farming knows about OMAFRA. Obviously, there's a lot of rules and things, but they're a huge support for us as well, and we'll get into that. Next slide. So there's our hives. Okay, in this picture, I think we're showing 2, 4, 6, 8 hives. Okay, and you'll notice on these hives that they're different heights, right? And maybe if you've been driving along the roadside, you might have seen hives there. And I can tell a little bit, given how high they are, this is getting quite late in the summertime. Okay. And we'll talk about why they're different heights as we move along. Next slide, please. So let's talk about bees. What I wanted to talk to you today about is a little bit about bees and the beekeeper, and then also some of the challenges that we have there. But before we begin, I actually want to test your knowledge. Okay, let's just see how much you do know. The first question, hopefully, is quite easy, okay? How many queens are there in a single hive? Okay, I see people putting, okay, you got that one. Great, okay, next slide, please. Okay, what's the difference between a worker bee and a drone?
The drone dies.
The drone dies. Worker bee is a female, drone is a male. Right on. What's a queen then?
Queen is
That. So we're going to get into that, okay? We're going to come back to this. We're going to talk a bit more about worker bees and queens and drones next, please. Okay, here's my trick question. And before you shout out a number, because some of you may know the answer, okay? But for those, how many bees typically are there in a hive? So turn to the person next to you and give a number, okay? Okay, so just by show of hands, who said somewhere around 200 to 300? Okay, who said maybe 500? A few more hands go up. All right, how many were brave enough to get to 1,000? Okay, so we've got some brave people. 2,000? 3,000? 10,000? 25,000? 50,000? Oh, I see one hand at 50,000. Two hands at 50,000. So they are, in fact, correct. 50,000 bees in a single hive, okay? In the summer, actually, you can get up to 75,000, okay? So when we open up a hive, okay, and we wear this bee suit here, and we put this headgear on, okay, it's because when you've got 75,000 bees flying around you, right, you do want to be a little bit protected. Most of the time, we don't wear gloves, okay? And if we get stung on our hands the odd time, it does hurt a little bit, but you don't want to get stung in the face because it really swells up and it's not pretty. But there are during the summer between 50 and 75,000 in a typical hive, right? Depending on how productive the queen is. Okay, next slide. What do bees do in the winter? Sleep, hibernate. Okay, actually, most people think they hibernate, and it's very logical to think that, but they don't hibernate. Hibernate means your whole metabolism slows down and you kind of go into the sleep. They're fully awake, they're fully there, they're inside the hive, they're flapping their wings to stay warm. They want to keep that queen alive, right? The queen is the survival of the hive. No queen, the hive dies. So she sits in the middle and they do something what they call cluster. So they cluster around her, they flap their wings and they stay warm. And the reason that they get honey all through the summer is because that's what they need to survive through the winter time. And what we'll see on a warm day, we haven't had too many yet. Well, it was very warm on Sunday, but it was almost too windy. But once the sun starts to come out in a few warm days, you'll see them coming out, and guess what they're doing? Looking for a queen? Not quite, not yet. They've been eating a lot over the winter. What do you think they need to do? More than exercise. They need to poop. So they come out and they start pooping, and you'll see it on the snow. You'll see poop. We've had them land on our arms, and they'll leave, and they'll go, they pooped on our arms, right? So, yeah, that's part of nature. I guess that's what they need to do. Okay, next slide. Why do bees swarm? So we talked a little bit about swarming. So how many times, I kind of laugh about it, but as a beekeeper, all of a sudden you'll hear in the news or you'll read in the paper that there was a swarm in downtown Toronto and it landed on a car or it landed on a fire hydrant and, they closed the road down and they, like, a swarm is beautiful. Okay, a swarm is gorgeous. Okay, we love to see swarm. Well, we don't actually love to see swarm, but when we do, we understand how beautiful these swarms are, right? In fact, for the most part, bees are very docile when they're swarming. And what is a swarm? A swarm is when a hive decides it's time to build another hive. So they create a second queen, okay? The first queen says, I better get out of here before the new queen comes because there can only be one queen. And if there's two, they will fight to death, right? So what happens is the first queen says, when it's time to get out of here because that next queen's going to hatch momentarily. Let's get out of here. So we don't know how, we don't know why, how it all works, but somebody in the hive decides it's time to go. And so the bees that go with the old queen will actually gorge themselves, so their bellies are full. And all of a sudden you'll see them come out of the hive. And we've seen it. They come out of the hive, okay, and they land somewhere temporarily. So the queen has landed, looks like on that truck on the rear view mirror, and then they swarm around her. Okay, they're all gorged, so they're not like they're protecting their home or fighting. They're looking for a home. They send scouts out looking for a place to live, okay? In nature, that's typically like a hollow in a tree, right? And so they'll find it. The scouts will come back and report to the hive, and then at some point usually within 15 minutes to 2 days, that hive will up and go to their new permanent place of where they're going to live. So this is just a temporary stop, right, for them in terms of the swarm time. All right. So we as beekeepers, we often get called to come and capture the swarm. I usually get 2, 3, 4 calls, usually in kind of the June time frame, or early enough in the season that the new queen can actually get into the hive. They can start building the hive, collect enough nectar, right, before the winter comes and the cold weather comes, right? So we'll go in there, I'll go in there, usually with a full bee suit on at that point, but you can walk right up to them. Like you can stand next, when you saw the first slide when we were standing right next to those 2 swarms, right? Like they're actually pretty docile at that point. I'm not suggesting you should go in and start, but no, they're great. It's an amazing thing of nature. Next slide, please. Okay, liquid honey or crystal honey. What's the difference? Nothing. It starts as liquid. It will crystallize over time. If you don't like crystallized honey, you can just warm it up again. It'll go back to liquid. It's the same thing, right? It is raw honey, though, right? And so when we talk about beekeepers and you see them at the farmers markets and they're selling their honey, that's raw honey, unpasteurized. Okay, very safe to eat if it's been properly, processed. But yeah, really no difference. Next slide. So when we talk about the hive, okay, we see here on this picture, we can see basically there's 2 major components. There we call the deep super, okay? You see the deep super, and then just above that you see something called the queen excluder, okay? And above that you see honey supers. So what we do as beekeepers is we try to keep the queen at the bottom section of the hive, and it's there she can lay all her eggs and create new bees, right? In what we call the brood chamber, right? So that's the lower piece, and we put a queen excluder. It's just something, the queen's much bigger than the other bees, and so she just can't physically fit through, and it allows all the other bees to go upstairs, but she kind of keeps to the bottom, right? And the reason why that's important for us, because come time to extract the honey, we just take everything from the queen excluder up, and we know that it's just honey, okay? There's no brood, there's no babies, there's nothing happening otherwise there, right? And so what happens is we start after the winter time now. Heather and I, we keep what we call 2 deep supers. So our bees overwintering with 2 deep supers. Pretty soon, in another month or so, okay, we'll unwrap them. We do kind of put a blanket around them, okay? And the queen has now already started laying eggs. So the queen doesn't lay eggs through the summertime, but she's now started laying eggs. And so she's starting to build up her brood nest, okay? And then as it starts to fill up, they need more room to grow, right? And rather than going somewhere else, we just add another layer. So we add another layer, honey super. And then through the summer, as they start to fill that up, then we add another honey super, and then another honey super. And so that picture I showed you early on, where you had different hives with different number of supers, is very much the productivity of the queen, right? How well is she doing in terms of laying eggs? A newer queen will be a bit more aggressive and typically will be taller. And so that's why you see the different heights, right? That are there. Okay, next. So the queen, she's bigger than the worker bees. She lays about 1,500 eggs a day. She'll start about now, March, and she'll do that all the way through until about the end of September, mid-October, okay? She's groomed and fed by the worker bees, okay? There's only one queen that we talked about, and yeah, it's pretty difficult to find the queen. You know, as a beekeeper, I mean, people come, we have visitors come and they want to see the queen, and it's not that easy to find the queen. I sometimes talk, it's like, where's Waldo, if you remember that book, right? But instead of thinking of finding Waldo in one book, imagine you had 10 or 20 books and there was only one Waldo in all of those books. So you'd have to go through all of those books before you could find the queen. So there are some places we know she'll hang out and find, but not always the easiest to find. Next, please. So there she is. Again, she is a bit bigger, okay, but still difficult, right? Like you really have to have an eye on what she's doing. And so this is looking inside the hive. Oh yeah, actually I have here, and I should pass these around. Heather, do you want to just? So I did bring a couple of, these are called frames, and you can pass them around. I've got two here, okay? The wax on these frames is quite brittle at this point. They've been outside most of the winter in a cold storage area, and the wax kind of gets hard. But that's what we're seeing right here, right? This is all the honeycomb that's there, right? And so we pull these frames out of the hives. And we're looking and we're studying these hives, okay? And what I see here is a lot of brood, okay, capped brood. So what's happened is the queen's laid an egg, and then it's gone to the larva stage and the pupa stage, and eventually an adult bee will eat its way out of that brood and work its way out. But that's what we're looking at there. Next slide, please. So the queen. What about the sex life of the queen? So the queen, she'll actually mate with about a dozen or more drones. She has what they call mating flights. So a virgin queen will hatch and come out, okay? And then over several days, she will do these mating flights where she'll mate with the drones, okay? They mate 200 to 300 feet up in the air. The drone gets to only mate once, and after that, they die, okay? Only about 1% of drones actually get to mate with the queen, you know, so it's a pretty low percentage. And then she stores the sperm, okay? And believe it or not, she has those mating flights for a few days, and then that's it for the rest of her life. She comes into the hive, okay, and she'll never leave again unless she's swarming, okay? And a queen can last up to 5 years. So if you think about, 1,500 eggs a day from March till October, for 4 to 5 years, it's an incredible that she can do that with those few mating flights that she has as a virgin queen. Okay, next please. So the worker bee, we mentioned she's a female, okay. So the worker bee, there's roughly 50,000 worker bees in the hive, okay. And just what are the jobs that a worker bee has, okay? Well, they clean the cells. Okay, and in fact, this is the order. When they're young, they start by cleaning, and then as they get a little bit older, they become undertakers. Okay, they drag out the old bees that have died. Okay, then they get into the nursery. Then they attend to the queen. Okay, and then they actually accept the nectar. So you have foragers going out and bringing it to the entrance of the hive, and then they take that, they add their enzymes, they put it into each cell, okay? And then at that point, it's very watery, so it needs to evaporate. The water needs to evaporate to concentrate. A bit like maple syrup almost, right? But they do all of that. They also accept pollen, okay, and they pack the pollen in there. So you need both your carbohydrates and your proteins, right? So you've got your nectar and your pollen. Those are the two key things that the bees need, okay? They fan it to make sure that it stays cool in the summer, or if it's too humid, because they've got to get rid of that humidity out of the nectar. They build the comb, they cap the comb, they are the guards. So anytime you're getting stung, it's by a worker, right? Or by a drone. And lastly, the last job they do is they actually go out and forage. They go out to the flowers and get the nectar from the flowers and the pollen, right? So it's a pretty busy life for the worker and a pretty important job. And And as a community, they work together unbelievably well, right? Next. So what about the drone? What does the drone do then? Because it sounds like the workers covered most of the roles. Well, the drone's larger, okay? It's actually hatched from unfertilized eggs. So a queen will lay an egg but won't fertilize it. That's what a drone is, okay? They don't forage for food. They don't build the comb. They don't defend the combs. They don't have a stinger. In fact, if you think about kind of in a human life, okay, they don't clean, they don't cook, they don't take out the garbage, they don't drive the kids to appointments. Okay? Or as I say, they sit on the couch, they watch TV, watch the football game, you know. The workers serve them, feed them, do everything, okay? And, well, I mean, we know what the one role of a drone is. I don't have to explain that. But come September, the workers say, well, we don't need these drones anymore. The queen's not going to be going out for mating flights in the wintertime. So it's time to kick the drones out. And so there's no drones over the winter. If we were to open a hive now, it would be only worker bees and that one queen. And there'd be no drones. But she'll start pretty soon now to start laying drone eggs. Because she'll need to create drones for when a queen is, for a virgin queen in the summertime. Okay, next.
Where do they go? Where do they go?
They kicked out and died.
Oh.
Yeah. Bees only last about 4 to 6 weeks during the summer period. They do overwinter, but when they're out working and doing, a typical bee is 4 to 6 weeks. And that's it, right? So they have quite a short life. Okay, next.
That's it.
Oh. Okay, well. One more? Ah, there we go. So this is what it looks like inside one of those cells, okay? So on the right, I'd say it looks like rice, okay? I mean, it's much smaller than rice. So what Heather and I are doing when we're going into the hive is we want to make sure that there's a queen there and doing the queen things, right? And it's hard, I mentioned already, to find the queen. But if we see eggs, okay, and what you're seeing there is about a 3-day-old egg because the egg's already started to fall over, okay? But we know that at least 3 days ago there was an active queen laying eggs, right? So you don't always have to see the queen, but you have to be able to go in the hive and see what's going on and what's there. Eventually those eggs start to grow, they get bigger and bigger, and they can't fit in, and you see they start to wrap themselves around, okay? So they move from the egg stage to the larva stage at this point. Next slide. Okay, so there's a much closer up view of the egg. Again, it's tiny, tiny, tiny. I have to have my glasses to see them when it's there. Okay, but that's kind of cut away. You see the side of the cell. Next slide. So now it's grown up. Okay, so now we're getting to the pupa stage and soon into the adult stage. You see the eyes are starting to form. You can see the legs are starting to come there, and we can actually, cut the top. They cap the top of the cell, and from time to time we'll scrape away just to see, and you can actually see that bee that's not quite adult yet, but getting very close. Okay, next. And then the adult bee starts chewing its way out, right? And that's always fun when we have visitors coming because we'll try to find a frame where you can actually see the activity, and you'll see the bee starting to chew its way out, and then eventually it comes right out, and then it starts as a new worker bee, and yeah, that's it. It's amazing. It's amazing actually. Next. All right, so a few bee facts. A single colony typically has about 100 pounds of honey. We talked about 60 to 75,000 bees. They fly 24 kilometers an hour. The queen lays about 2,000 eggs. Interesting, it takes over 500 bees a lifetime to make a pound of honey. Right? So it's a small thing. It's like less than a tablespoon, or a teaspoon each bee. Right? Average bee is 4 to 6 weeks. When they bring nectar back, it's about 70% honey. It needs to go down to 17%. Why 17%? Because if there's too much moisture, it will create mold, right? So one of the things when we're taking honey out of the hive, as beekeepers, we're always checking for the moisture content, right? And as long as it's below 18%, you can put it in a jar and you can keep it for years like that, and you can open the jar and eat it without a problem, right? If there's too much moisture, it'll start to, not distill, what's the word I'm looking for? Ferment. Obviously there's honey, but the other thing that bees do is pollinating, okay? They're huge for pollinating all the different crops. And interestingly, they don't pollinate every flower, okay? So apple trees, huge. Honeybees are huge, right? White clover, huge, right? But other things, they just don't do, right? And so honeybees are important, but they're not the only pollinators. And I don't want to say that, hey, honeybees are the only thing. There are many different species of insects that are critical overall to the health of the environment. Next. We do have a Bees Act. In fact, it's one of the oldest acts in Ontario. Bees have been around for a long time. And the Ministry, OMAFRA, as I mentioned, they manage that. They have bee inspectors, okay? What I haven't talked too much about till now is the problem, the challenge with honeybees is pests and disease, okay? And so what's important as a beekeeper is we want to make sure that our hives are healthy, okay? If they're not healthy, the problem is they will interact with other bees from other hives, and then they will transmit these diseases over, right? And so, you know, that's why we say when people want to get into beekeeping, which we highly encourage, but you need to make sure from a biosecurity point of view that you're doing all the right things, because, you know, you can be relaxed in what you're doing and cause problems to other hives in the area, right? And so, and that's the importance, as beekeepers, that's why it's important. We're always talking, we're always managing with OMAFRA. Bee inspectors will come out and check our hives to make sure that there aren't any pests or diseases. And if so, they can get, depending on what disease or pest you have, they, through the Bees Act, they have the right to actually take your hive and burn it to the ground. Because there's one disease called foul brew that if you get it, the only answer is you have to burn everything. You have to burn all the bees, you have to burn all the equipment, all your tools have to be sterilized. So it's not a nice thing, but that's part of beekeeping. Next. So what do we get out of bees? What are the sorts of things? Obviously honey, right? And I think that's what people mostly know about is honey. I was talking here today about pollen. You know, people do buy pollen, or sometimes known as bee bread. There's royal jelly, which is what the queen gets fed her entire life, you know, and it's supposedly very high in nutrients and good things that help your body. There's propolis. Propolis is like their construction material. If there's a hole in the hive, they can seal up that hole with propolis. They get propolis from the barks of trees. And again, some people think, probably true, but they consume propolis and think it has good health benefits to you. You know, if you go into your natural store, you can get all these things there. Bee venom, actually getting stung, there's some people think that that's good for you. I'm not completely in that camp, but and then there's beeswax, right, for making candles and other things, right? So quite a few different things that come out of the hive other than just honey. Next, please. So what are those challenges? You know, what are some of the things that we as beekeepers, I have to keep an eye on the time. Am I getting close? I'm okay still. Okay. So what are some of the challenges that we have here? So the very first one there is called Varroa Mite. Okay. By far and away, that's our #1 challenge. And if you see down there on this slide down at the bottom, you see the white bee that we've pulled out of the cell before it actually became an adult and dug its way out. And you can see that it's got 2 mites on it. Okay, so these mites, they actually go into the cell when the queen lays the egg, and just before the hive seals up that cell, the mite jumps inside and starts laying eggs. Okay, and then when the adult bee, eats its way out comes the adult bee, and out comes 10 mites with it, right? And then they find another place to go, and they do it all over again. The mites are problematic. They take the energy out of the bees. They introduce other viruses and problems. So these mites are a challenge for us. And it's a global issue, so it's not just something that happens in Ontario. Beekeepers all around the world talk about Varroa mites and how do we manage Varroa mites. It's number one. There are other types of mites. There are wax moths. Small hive beetle is something that has just come into Ontario in the last couple of years. Hasn't quite made its way up here, but it's in Windsor and Niagara, and it will be here. It will probably be here this summer, and if not, by next summer. I mentioned about American foul brood. If you get it, you have to burn your hive to the ground. And then there's things like chalk brood. And then lastly, there's pesticides. And so you hear about pesticides. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is the Varroa mite. There's a picture there. You can see it. You can physically see it, but it's very hard to find, right? So there's different methods that through the OBA, the Ontario Bee Association, and through some of the global bee associations about how to monitor, how to manage, and how to check for those mites. Next slide, please. Okay, so pesticides. So, pesticides are pretty amazing products when you're a farmer, when you do things, when you're planting corn and soybean especially. There's neonicotinoids is what is the main kind of classification. There's many different brands and names and things, but generally they're known as neonicotinoids or neonics. And the problem is that if you have your beehive next to a cornfield, for example, and it happens to be a windy day and they're spraying for corn, okay, there's a good chance that that's going to spray over and into your bees. And if you know the story about the canary in the mine, right? The old days, the miners would have a canary there, and as soon as they saw the canary died, they knew there were bad gases in there. Get the heck out, because the canary would always die first, right? And so bees are somewhat like that as well, in that they're much more sensitive to these chemicals than, say, we are as humans, right? But we have many cases in Ontario of where bees have been next to cornfields or soybean fields, and they've died as a result. The entire hive gets wiped out, or I know beekeepers that have had 10 hives, and all 10, dead the next day or the next few days, right? Because of that. So there are practices. OMAFRA obviously is part of farming as well. There are practices that farmers need to do, and as long as they do those, but there's always a fight. There's always this fight around pesticides and where do you keep your bees. Heather and I were lucky because we keep our bees on our own property. We have enough acreage, and luckily none of the farms around us have had corn in the last few years or soybeans. So we personally haven't seen any detrimental effects because of pesticides. But that's the other challenge in beekeeping. Okay, actually this is my last slide. So how many beekeepers are there in Canada? These are Canadian stats. I didn't get the Ontario ones. But you can see in 2021 there were 13,000 registered beekeepers. Okay, we're all supposed to be registered. We have to register. We have to identify our location, how many hives we have. A bee inspector may pop up and show up, without even telling us. That's their right as part of OMAFRA. But there are 13,000. In Canada, there's over 800,000 colonies. In terms of how much honey is that? It looks like it's 89 million pounds. And the value of honey is $250 million in Canada. So it's not a huge business, when you consider farming and cattle and wheat and everything else. But they say that pollinating, the actual pollination, again, is about 10 times the value than what actually the honey is, right? So in that respect, then honeybees are important. So the last thing I'll just finish up with, I know sometimes people buy honey from farmers markets, and it's great, right? Because one of the challenges that we have is imported honey that's been adulterated, right? So it's very easy to take some honey, and why not add a little bit of sugar water into it? That's a lot cheaper, right? And then you sell what you think is 100% honey might only be 75% honey and 25% sugar water, and guess what? Someone's making some good money, right? So they're testing for it all the time, all the honey that gets imported, but we continue to find examples of that. So I personally, I think we personally have been very much going to your local farmer's market, buying from your local farmer, right? Getting really honey right out of locally. And then the last thing I would say is, again, I've had friends say, well, yeah, but they charge the same that if I go to a grocery store. The grocery store, it's got to go here, and it's got to go there, and then it's got to go to this store. Like, surely it must be cheaper, right? But I can tell you, beekeepers aren't making a ton of money. That's why we're hobby beekeepers, Heather and I. We typically have about 10 hives. A commercial beekeeper will have anywhere from 500 to 1,000 hives typically. But it's a tough go. It's a tough go. Like farming, right? It's not always the easiest. And you're subject to disease. You're subject to weather. Interestingly, one of the things that COVID has done is most commercial beekeepers want to make sure they have good, fresh queens very early in the season, because then she can build up the hive and you can get maximum honey, right? In our case, what Heather and I do is we don't ever buy queens, because we're hobby beekeepers, right? And so it's not important. The queen, if we don't get a new queen until the beginning of July, for example, that's enough time for her to build up the hive to get it in good shape to survive the winter. But we won't get any honey from that hive, right? In the very first picture I showed when you saw all the different hives, okay, probably that was because we had a queen that came midsummer, and she's still down sitting in 2 supers, right? And really hasn't had the time to build that up. But if you're a commercial beekeeper, that's money lost, right? Like, you need a fresh queen. So what I was saying is COVID has impacted us because you haven't been able to import queen bees from New Zealand, from the Ukraine, from California, right? Because all the global travel things kind of got shut down, right? So, but yeah, a commercial beekeeper would typically replace the queen pretty much every year, right? So, if you had 500 hives, you'd likely be buying close to 500 queens and replace them, because that gives you your maximum honey output and stuff. What we do, interestingly, I didn't mention this, but a queen is a female, so is a worker bee. So what's the difference, okay? A worker bee and queen both start off exactly the same for the first 3 days. So that egg that the queen laid, okay, a worker bee or a female egg, it's the same. Starting on day 4, okay, a queen would be in a much bigger cell. Like, it's 2 or 3 or 4 times the size of a normal cell. And the queen is fed royal jelly through her whole life, which means she grows up to be a full woman with a full reproductive system. Whereas a worker bee sits in this small cell, okay, much more squished, doesn't get the full royal jelly treatment, okay, and so they grow up to be females as well, but they don't have a developed reproductive system, and so they can't lay eggs. And so that's the difference between kind of a worker bee and a queen. So what we do is, if we want to create another hive, either somebody calls us up and says, hey, there's a swarm, can you come get it? Which we did a few times last year. Or we just take one of the frames that I passed around, we take one of the frames, we look at it, we look to see, oh, there's a couple of 1 or 2 or 3 day old eggs. Okay? We take it out, and we put it in another box, okay? And we put some honey in there, and we put some pollen in there with it. And the bees, full with bees and everything, and the bees will look at it, okay, and they communicate. Well, how do they communicate? 2 key ways. Antennas? No. Wings? No. Dancing? Who said dancing? Dancing? They dance. That's one way they communicate. The other way they communicate is through pheromones. So when the queen's not there, they can actually smell, and they know that there's no queen, because they can't smell the pheromones of the queen. And so when we take that frame and we put it into another box, they're saying, hey, there's no queen here. And they immediately take usually about a half a dozen cells, and they immediately start to make them much bigger, which you would get from a queen, okay? And they continue to feed those royal jelly, okay? 16 days later, hopefully, out of those 6 cells, 1 or all of them will hatch a queen, okay? The queen will eat its way out, virgin queen, okay? The queen will look around and say, hey, there's 5 other cells here. I better go ahead and kill them before they get out, okay? So she goes and kills them all first, because there can only be 1 queen, okay? And then over the next few days, hopefully the weather is good and it's not raining, she'll go out and do her mating flights, and then we've got a new hive that we've started, right? And in a very similar way, commercial beekeepers will actually do the same thing, except rather than depending on the hive to make this bigger cell, they will actually make these rows, banks and rows of larger cells, and with like a little scoop, they'll scoop out the egg and put it into each one of those cells, right? So they're queen breeders. That's what they do, right? They breed queens, right? And so if we wanted to buy a virgin queen or a young, fresh, recently queen, then we would go to a queen breeder, and that's how they do it. Right? So kind of fun. Right?
How much would you have to pay for the queen?
I think yes. How much you have to pay for the queen? Last year, a queen, just a queen was I think about $45, $50. Often beekeepers will buy what they call a nuke, which is sort of a very small hive, and you might get 5,000 bees with a queen, right? So, and then you're paying around $200, $250.
Okay.
So, start, like say you want to start becoming a beekeeper. Do you go to another beekeeper and buy and he just sends some bees, or how do you start?
So the question is, how do you start? How do you start beekeeping? Where do you go? What do you do, right? You go to the bee store. There are bee stores. There's one in Innisfil, there's one in Owen Sound, there's 3 or 4 in the Toronto, Guelph region. You go there. Brian in Innisfil is a great guy. He's a super guy. You go there and you say, hey, I want to buy the hive, like the boxes. I want to buy the hive. I want to buy bee suits. There's certain tools you may have, right? Probably the most expensive thing is once you actually take the honey off, you have to get the honey out of those cells, right? So you need a tool to cut the wax off the top, decap it basically. You decap this, and then you need something to spin it. You need a spinner, right? Because otherwise it'll take, days and days. You'll be sitting there watching it drip out too slowly. But if you spin it, it happens quite quickly, right? So.
But if you wanted to start beekeeping, how many bees do you have to buy to start?
So the question is, how many bees you need to buy if you want to start beekeeping? So you can start with one colony, right? And you would go to a bee store. I jokingly say bee store, but that's what it is, right? It's a retail place. And you would put an order in, like, you're almost a bit too late now. You'd have to put it back, like, probably, Christmas time, and say, hey, I'd like to buy a nuke. And then usually around the first week in June, you'll get a call and say, your nuke's ready, come pick it up, right? And it's kind of in a small little portable box. And then you bring it home and you put it in your.
So would it include like workers and a queen?
Yeah. So the question is, what would it include? So a nuke, or when you're buying, would be one queen. Okay. 95% worker bees and maybe 5% drones in there. Right? That's a typical kind of. That's what most hives are, generally speaking. Question.
When the queen leaves the hive and she swarms, does that mean you've lost the colony?
The question was, if the queen swarms and leaves the hive, does that mean you lost your colony? No, because she only leaves once she knows there's another queen coming. So about half the bees leave with the old queen and go find a new place, and half stay with the new queen, right? And that's how, in nature, they reproduce hives, right?
But that queen now landing on the mirror on that truck at that time, what happens to all of those bees when she's fed up?
When she's what?
When she leaves there, do they just follow her?
Oh yes, they follow her. They follow her. So the scouts will have gone around. The question is, what happens when they're on the side of that truck, right? And so they send scouts out looking for a place to live, okay? And when the scouts come back and report back, and eventually the hive decides that, okay, we found a place to live, then she leaves, and they all follow her, and it's amazing. You watch in the sky, you see this swarm of bees going across, and it's loud too, like it's crazy, right? And away they go. So last year we had a hive swarm out of our hive, and it went maybe the distance from here to the length of this room, and luckily it landed on a tree that was only maybe 4 feet off the ground, right? And so I was able to go in, Heather and I were able to go in with our bee suits on, and basically take another hive, and it was on a branch, and we sometimes if you're lucky you can cut the branch, take the whole branch and just lay it into the box, and sometimes you can just shake the branch and it's enough that it'll fall down. We had one last summer, it was like like a full ladder length up in a tree, but we could still get it, right? So I went up with a Rubbermaid on this ladder with my bee suit on, and it was on a branch, and luckily again I was able to kind of hit the branch, and with my glove I was able to just kind of push them into this, Rubbermaid bucket that I had, climbing down the ladder with bees. Like now they're going crazy, right? They don't like that, right? So, but luckily I had the queen, right? And I took the Rubbermaid and I dumped it upside down into a hive that I had ready on the ground there, and you hope the queen's there. And I waited for about maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, okay? I put a lid on, but I left it open, okay, so they could get in and out. And after about 10 minutes or so, all of a sudden I started seeing bees going in, okay? And as soon as you see bees going in, you know you got the queen. They can smell her, they know, right? And then after about an hour, like they're walking down the tree, they're walking on the ground, they're walking up the hive, they're all going in. It's amazing. At night they always come home, right? They always come home and they're there. So then later that night, once it got dark, because it was not on our property, it was down the road. And so then later that night we went there, took some tape, sealed up some of the holes, just made sure it was all there, picked it up, put it in the van, drove it back to our farm, put it on the ground, took the tape off, right, and then the next morning they were there. And sometimes they'll still leave, sometimes they may not even like that and may swarm again or go find another place, but that's what they did.
When do you use the smoke?
Good question.
And what kind of smoke is it?
I brought a smoker, yeah. So what's the purpose of smoker? Well, I kind of gave you a hint around pheromones, right? That pheromones is how they talk. So when they sting you, they send off another pheromone. And the pheromone says you're getting attacked, right? It notifies all the guard bees. But when there's smoke, it confuses the pheromones, right? They can't transmit it. So the smoke is a way of masking the pheromones, and it kind of keeps everything relaxed, and hopefully they don't get too excited, right? So that's why we smoke them. It interrupts their pheromones, right?
What do you use to make the smoke though?
Oh, what do I use to make the smoke? Usually start with some newspaper and then put some wood chips in there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Pine cones or pine needles.
I'm going to take speaker chair privilege and just ask Paul one last question. Do you have any specific plants or flowers that you grow on your property that might be desirable when you're producing honey, or is it basically kind of random wildflowers or whatever is in the area that they gravitate towards?
I have no idea, but my wife, who is an avid gardener and who's sitting here, could probably tell us what are the she's shaking her head no, but I don't know. Wait, let's get the microphone. I didn't hear you say. Wait a second.
Lavender, poppies, echinacea, alyssum, scilla, that's what they go crazy. Buckwheat.
Oh yeah, buckwheat. I don't know if you like buckwheat honey. Some people love buckwheat honey. So the farmer across the street grew buckwheat a few years ago, right? And the bees come back and the honey's black. Like it's black, right? And it has a very unique taste. And it's amazing because you know how I showed the different supers as you grow up, as it goes up, right? Well, at a certain point, buckwheat is flowering, right? And you open up the honey, you open up your hive and you see all this beautiful golden honey, and then all of a sudden there's just a layer of black, right? And then it's golden again because the buckwheat's finished and they're on to some other flower, right? So.
Thank you, Paul. On behalf of Probus of Mountain View, we'd like to thank you for your really informative and interesting presentation. I know there were a lot of questions generated, and I'm sure Paul and Heather don't mind answering any questions that we didn't get a chance to take. And once again, I want to thank Paul for coming and telling us about beekeeping. And we know that your Toronto District Beekeepers Association will appreciate the donation in lieu of a speaker fee. So I'd like to thank you, and as will everyone in the audience. So thanks very much, Paul and Heather, for coming.